Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Frances, and I am the author of the Serpentia series. You can see that from Gold Publications. I'm also, aside from being a writer of furry stories, I'm a reader of furry stories, and I am very excited about the Oxford Comic Convention. So super glad to be here. I'm going to be reading, hopefully, if we have time, from two stories. The first one is this little book, Rightful, Salvage, put out by Gold Publications. And it's about a trio of bears on a spaceship and a really unusual stowaway. So we're going to start with chapter 2. Scratch carried a box of filters she'd found in the ruined colony's supply closet. She held the crate in front of her chest and could barely see Gargle's silvery white back over the top of the thing. They returned to the ship with their arms full, with Gargle's hover sled loaded with salvage, and with the prickle in Scratch's tail that said trouble was right behind them. "You sure that quarantine's been lifted?" she asked for the 10th time. You're sure. At the head of their line, Mass twisted her massive head around, still shuffling forward, and glanced back along the line. "I've told you a dozen times already. It's clean." "No one's left to give us their germs," Gargle shrugged and adjusted the crates he carried, one on each silver hip. "We're going to make a mint on this run." "A mint won't help us if we have to use it to pay for our coffins," Scratch mumbled, low enough that it wouldn't reach Mass. Gargle heard, but the big idiot's only reply was a soft shaking of his shoulders, laughing. He'd laugh his way to the grave if Scratch let him. She told herself they'd be fine. Mass thoroughly researched Peleg on Paris 5 before she allowed them to land. She looked out for her crew, and Scratch had been given none in all the years they'd flown together, to doubt the captain. So why did the fur on the back of her neck lift and prickle? Why was she certain they were about to walk into a whole armload of trouble? The colony had been dead as expected, ripe for salvage and as creepy as a graveyard. They'd seen plague worlds before. They'd seen it all, and nothing in the abandoned domes explained the tingle in her tail. The hesitation she felt in each step forward. Not even when the ship came into view did the tension abate. They carried their load up the ramp and secured them in the cargo netting, and Scratch still felt the urge to twist around, to keep one eye on whatever was sneaking up behind them. "Everything secure?" Mass stood in the hatch, paws on hips, as she eyed their latest haul. "Aye, Cap." Gargle leaned against the forward door, grinning his stupid grin, as if the whole world were just an oversized party. "Scratch?" They both looked at her, waiting for her to pee all over their mood. "Got a bad feeling," she said. "Of course she does," Gargle groaned and played at banging his head against the door frame. "Try a little harder," Scratch suggested. "Maybe you'll knock some sense into you." "Stop it." Mass crossed her arms, and they both turned to face their captain at attention, waiting to be scolded. "Anything specific, Scratch?" "Not yet, Cap." Scratch relaxed a little, knowing the captain took her worries seriously went a long way toward relieving them. "Just uneasy." "Noted. Keep me posted if it gets specific, and you," she waved a big paw at Gargle, "you'd be wise to pay attention to Scratch's hunches, young man." Scratch hid a grin behind her paw. Gargle hated when they pointed out his youth, and the white face scrunched with his effort not to talk back to Mass. "Very well," the captain continued. "I think we're ready to button up. Scratch, you're on the engines, Gargle can close up, and I'll start launch prep on deck." "Aye, Cap." They said it in unison. But as soon as Mass lumbered from the cargo bay, Gargle turned a snarl back for Scratch. His black lips rippled beneath his nose in a grimace that might have scared anyone who didn't actually know him. "You've got something in your teeth," Scratch said. She didn't bother hiding her smirk when Gargle's paw shot up to his mouth. She didn't bother trying not to laugh either, and by the time she scooted past the big idiot and shuffled her way toward engineering, her mood had lightened. The worrisome feeling still nagged at her, but she shoved it to the back of her mind and headed for the access letter and down into the belly of the ship, to the engines, to the one place she was in absolute control. And by the time her nose filled with the happy aroma of hot grease, she'd forgotten everything but coils and pipes, wires, and the sweet sanctuary of her own domain. When Gargle stomped from the cargo bay, the ship already hummed beneath his paws. He'd secured the hatches, checked the seals twice, and should be on his way to the bridge for takeoff. But Scratch had thrown him off kilter. He kicked at nothing, stopped marching, and glared along the empty corridor. Scratch got under his fur like no other Ursine he'd ever met. It hadn't helped that the captain brought up his age. He wasn't that much younger than them. And he'd gotten top marks at the academy. He'd earned his place here, young or not, and if Scratch couldn't see that, Gargle growled, a low rumble that echoed toward the fore. Why did he care if she could see that? He kicked out again, shook his head, and pivoted toward his quarters, tapping a wall comm as he passed it. Permission to spend launch in my quarters? Affirmative, kiddo, Mass's voice echoed back. Strap in, though. ICAP. Scratch would think he was pouting, but why should he care what the shaggy little engineer thought? Why should he want her to look at him with anything other than complete disapproval? She was a burr under his tail, an annoyance and nothing more. But did she have to take every opportunity to make him look stupid? As if he'd never be enough, never be anything more than a dumb cub in her eyes. He growled at his toes and marched into his quarters so fast the door almost couldn't get out of his way. The launch chair folded down from the wall, and Gargle slammed it into position and sat just as the engines began to really whine. Scratch would launch in the belly, no doubt, strapped in with her tool belt bunched up around her shaggy midsection. Gargle grumbled as he slid on his straps, snapping the fastens only a breath before the floor lurched under his paws and his head was pressed back hard against the seat padding. The ship leaping into the atmosphere forced his gaze up. The pressure of their trajectory held him tight against the seat. His jaw dropped just the same. He stared at the impossible thing and remembered Scratch's words in the cargo bay. Got a bad feeling. It wasn't the least attractive thing about the little engineer, always being right, but it sure got irritating at times like this. Cap? The comm was online during launch, ready to listen because one tiniest of issues became an emergency during takeoff. The issue lying on Gargle's cot was not tiny in the least. Go, Gargle. Mass's voice was tight, strained from concentration. All business. He took a deep breath. Damn Scratch anyway. She'd blame him for this somehow. This would be all his fault. Gargle? Sorry, Cap. He let his breath out and the words all at once. His eyes never left the bunk, never flinched from the figure sprawled across his blankets. Hate to interrupt and all, but we have a problem. Who is she? Mass stared at the sleeping human and tried to work out where she'd come from. How did she survive the plague? Maybe she didn't, Scratch grumbled. Maybe she brought it right on board to share with us. They'd settled into low orbit without any technical issues, but the stowaway was a worse sort of trouble. Even if she did look sad and helpless, curled up on the side on Gargle's bunk. You're sure it's a she? The big white bear glanced to Scratch as if looking for approval. Always looking, that one. Clueless and infatuated whether he knew it or not. You can't assume gender based on appearance. What does it matter? Scratch snarled. It's a human, and it's not supposed to be on our ship. Mass sighed. They'd have to report this. They'd have to wait for an official answer and some sort of instructions on how to proceed. In the meantime, they had cargo that was not getting to market, fuel that would not last forever, and supplies that, Well, they always kept well stocked. It was still bound to be inconvenient as hell. Not the quick in and out she'd planned for, and depending on the orders they received, likely to eat up any profit she'd hoped to make off of Paris 5. It looks like a cub, Gargle said. Something warm settled in Mass's chest. She gazed down at the sleeping human and sighed. It had light tan skin and yellow hair and barely reached its shoulders. Its body was covered in a colony jumpsuit, but compared to the few humans they'd encountered, this one did seem small, thin-limbed, and fragile. Mass imagined one of her own cubs curled on its side like that and let another sigh escape. Just a cub, she purred. Oh, no you don't, Scratch said. Who cares if it's a cub? Gargle stamped one foot and looked back and forth between them. Why won't it wake up? And how do we get it off my bunk? It might be contagious, Scratch leaned back. Maybe it's dying and we can just nudge it out the lock. Scratch! Mass's heart clutched in her furry chest. We'll do no such thing. She imagined a lost cub, left behind on a plague world, somehow surviving on her own for 10 years of quarantine. How small had she been when her parents died? She must have been so terrified. What do we do, Cap? Scratch asked. We need to get her to medical. Mass watched the jumpsuit rise and fall as the cub breathed. Her eyes remained closed, her body limp, but she was still alive. She was a survivor, after all. I'm not touching it, Scratch sniffed and shuffled backwards. I'll do it, Gargle volunteered, another attempt to impress the unresponsive engineer. He leaned over the sleeping human, but paused short of touching her. Instead, he reached for the bunk's frame and rattled it, gently. The girl shifted. She moaned and tossed her head to one side as if she'd been slapped. Wait! Scratch shuffled back, peered around Mass, and pointed one paw at the bunk. Did you see that? What's it got on its neck? Where? Gargle sniffed above the girl, black nose wrinkling. She smells funny. Could it be the plague? Mass's stomach tightened. She wanted to help the cub, wanted to rescue her and make her safe, but the idea of the contagion had her leaning back again. Lift up her hair, Scratch said. Use something besides your paw, idiot. I wasn't going to touch her, Gargle argued, but he pulled a magazine from his belt and used the end of it to brush the yellow hair aside. I'll be damned, Scratch said. Well, it ain't contagious. How can you be sure? Gargle leaned to the side now, closer to Scratch. When he sniffed again, Mass had to stuff a paw in her muzzle to keep quiet. Because it's not a human. When Scratch was pleased with herself, her voice deepened. Her ears came forward from their perpetual glower, and she almost looked tall enough to reach the counter in the mess hall. Almost. It's not? Gargle's infatuation spilled over in a tone so full of awe it hung in the air around Scratch like a cloud. A cloud the engineer refused to notice. Nope. Mass watched them, half hoping they'd get it over with and just mate already. The other half of her worried about the cub. If it wasn't sick, then why wouldn't it wake up? If it wasn't a plague carrier, maybe they could keep it. Tell us, Scratch. She watched the fragile chest lift and fall again, so small and so very alone. Because of this, Scratch stepped so close to Gargle, Mass thought he would fall over in a dead swoon. But the engineer paid no notice. Instead, she brushed aside the golden hair and revealed the most curious thing. A string of numbers and letters were printed beneath, stamped straight into the cub's skin, as if. Is that? Mass frowned at the marking. Serial number, Scratch said, so full of herself even Gargle snorted. We've got ourselves an android. That's book 2, or chapter 2 of book 1, Rightful Salvage, from Gold Publications. And next I'm going to read from The Skyfires, which is the sequel to The Earth Tigers, which won the Leo Award, I think, in 2017. And this book just came out, The Skyfires, and both Earth Tigers and Skyfires are going to be on sale for 99 cents for Furry Book Month. So, and this is a chapter entitled Wisp Hunt. Millie's heart lifted when they caught the sound upon the wind. A faint humming stole through the fronds, and she reached for her sling with eager fingers. At her hip, a bag of stones hung. With one hand, she slid a missile free as the other hand brought up the sling. She crouched, flexing her knees and listening to the jungle. Still to the south, Horach whispered near her ear. His velvet toes brushed the side of her neck, tiny claws prickling her skin. We're meant to spy, Millie, not battle. She closed her eyes, grunting non-committal sounds. In her mind, she saw the red and black beast lifting Saku from her. She remembered the spiny grip of a wisp as it seized her, and she imagined the sleek black body exploding just as the clay dummies had. Here we go. Horach quieted as she crept forward. A warm breeze riffled the vines, carrying the droning sound again, closer now, moving in their direction. Millie twisted her neck and tried to find a patch of clear sky. They'd need more visibility than this if the wisps passed above them. They'd need a better view, and she'd need a clean shot. Her sling was a heavy comfort in her grip. She moved on, crouched and weaved between the foliage in an effort to remain silent and invisible from above. She breathed deeply, inhaling the thick, earthy scent of rotting vegetation and flowers meant to draw scavengers and meat-eating insects. This part of the jungle was foreign to her, far from her own village, but the sound of the wind drew her onward like a greeting from an old friend, or an old enemy. Horach. She paused and twisted, but the jungle overhead did not break. Can you get higher? Scout ahead for an opening in the fronds. In answer, he sprang from her shoulder, landing on the nearest trunk and skittering up the bark as if it were flat as the ground. Millie hefted her sling and continued through the dense growth, certain Horach could move faster from trunk to trunk, that the Trant could keep her up with her easily. They'd journeyed for days in this manner on her way to the Pyramid City. They'd travel again for a day and a night on her way here. And despite the brief sleep on rough ground, Millie's whole body felt energized, ready to pounce. This way, Horach called from the trunk beside her. 2 wisps, flying back and forth across the canopy to the southwest. Hunting, Millie said. What are they after? All the Trant scouts and their hands remained in the city. Since the battle beside the rift, no wisp had threatened that sanctuary. Horach believed it was because they feared they were great ones inside the walls already. The wisps had no idea of their numbers or defensive ability. Millie thought it was because the spiders were contained and that the wisps were busy about other plans with no fear of attack or interference. Though they'd argued both theories into long evenings atop the Pyramid of the Hands, their current mission was a strong suggestion she'd been correct. I don't know. Horach landed on her shoulder, a sudden soft weight as if he'd manifested there. But they're definitely searching, each pass only a little beyond the next. The droning swelled as they went, each careful step bringing the humming more fiercely to her ears. Sunlight angled through the canopy, slanting rays that glowed weakly and spoke of late afternoon, of waning daylight and oncoming dusk. The light grew, however, as she crept forward, a sure sign that Horach had found her a clear space, and that the sky would be visible soon enough. The wisps searched overhead. Moving toward Millie, and Millie crouched and worked her way south to meet them. The jungle thinned. A clearing opened between the trees. What sunlight there was made a halo between the trunks. The vines glowed, and the overlapping fronds termed a warm viridian. Millie stopped just at the edge, sheltered by a ratty wall of shrubs with a tree at her back. She looked up, angled her neck, and readied her sling as the wisps buzzed closer. Millie held her breath. She felt the enemy coming, the vibration in the air around her, matching the droning, dragging at her like an invisible finger. Her stone was ready. The sling hung, a deadly weight from her fingers. When the fronds began to dance above, Millie circled her wrist, spun her weapon, and leaned out so that her view was as broad as possible. Her sling whirred. The wisp's humming rattled the fronds, overflowed the heavens, and trembled its way down into the ground. Millie's eyes shifted, scanning the open sky, scanning, and when the first hint of red appeared, latching onto it like a dart. A wisp flew above the clearing, low enough that she could see its gleaming eyes. Her breath stilled, an icy calm gripped her. The sling became part of her body, a long finger meant to reach out and strike her enemy. Millie's arm flew. Her stone lifted, shot straight for the black eye, and shattered it. The wisp shrieked. Its droning faded, but a sound like claws raking against stone erupted from the beast. The monstrous body stuttered mid-air, fell sharply to the side, and plummeted toward the jungle. Branches crashed. The shrieking died in the shattering of fronds and the rending of vines. Millie's quick fingers already reached for another stone. Her heart beat in her throat. A rushing sound filled her head, but she moved as she was trained, without thinking. She set her next bullet in place and began to swing again. Horach launched from her shoulder. Millie heard him for a breath, a soft scrabbling through the ground cover. Then the droning returned, and her attention fixed on the blue swath between the green. Her Trant would seek out the fallen wisp. He would report and warn. It was her job to kill. She saw the black eye, exploding inward as her stone found its mark. Her chest swelled, filling with pride and fury both. She swung her sling round and round as the air overflowed with coming. Red and black, a streak of motion over the trees. Millie tensed and spun, and froze when the next wisp appeared. Someone dangled beneath it. Millie's body seized. Her sling fell still, useless. Above the trees, the wisp swooped, carrying a black and red robed silhouette in its many limbs. "Millie!" Horach shouted near her ankles. She shook her head, squinting. "Millie!" he shouted, still sounding small and far away. The wisp drifted above the clearing. She strained to see, to know who it held. Her eyes blurred. Something sharp pinched her foot. The pain, the jabbing of tiny claws tore her back to attention. Horach's little toes beat at her ankle, and Millie looked just in time to see the wisp lunging in her direction. One eye was missing, but all 6 legs propelled it forward. It pushed away from the ground, red wing membranes blurring above its back. The long abdomen curled under, swooped forward, and thrust with its dagger sting. Millie screamed and rolled to the side. The wisp's attack slashed at the brush behind her. She scrambled away, scrambled with her sling useless and dangling. Branches crunched as the beast spun after her, as it readied for another strike. Too close, too near for the sling, and far too dangerous. She ran. Her feet snagged in the vines, and she tore them free. The wisp shrieked. Millie ducked and rolled in the other direction. This time the air whistled behind her as the stinger nearly found its mark. Horach shouted again, shouted in words that muddied in the burring of the wisp's wings. She had no time to wonder at it. The wisp was at her back. Millie dived for the clearing's edge, crashed into the tangle, hoping what slowed her would also ensnare her captor. She needed to think, needed a weapon that didn't require distance. The fronds slapped her face, vines grabbed her feet. She tumbled forward, landing on her hands and bracing herself for the feel of the stabbing abdomen. A scream tore through the air, farther behind her than she'd feared. She pushed at the vines and rolled over. The wisp reared to its hindmost legs. Its nearest wing buzzed like a storm, but the far one dangled, limp and fluttering, while the red abdomen bobbed up and down slowly. Millie scrabbled to her feet. She scanned the brush and snatched up a fallen branch. It was too big to wield with any grace, too stout to throw. She hefted it in both hands and swung with all her weight and rage. wood met exoskeleton. The branch smashed against an inky thorax, and the wisp's head swiveled. One good eye glinted at her as the body shattered, caving in like the clay effigy. The second wing died too, falling soft like a veil against the sides. The legs twitched once, then folded. Still, even when the whole thing lay limp upon the ground, the very end of it bobbed softly, stinging and stinging, stinging even in the throes of death. Millie dropped the branch, squatted in the brush, and sobbed. That is book 2 of the Earth Tigers. And I have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to say thank you for listening, and I hope you guys enjoy the con, and I will be sticking around for the whole thing, so maybe I'll see you in the chats or the forums. Thanks so much.